So, hey Alexia, really nice to meet you this evening. How are you feeling?
Great to be here. Nice to meet you as well, Jennifer. Very excited to start our chat.
Me too. So without any further ado, maybe we'll go ahead and give the audience an introduction of who you are, your current role, and what you're currently doing.
Right. So my current role is a real world data manager. I work for Pfizer UK. And what that involves is it's actually a new function. So Pfizer has actually transitioned more from being a marketing company to being more of a science-based pharmaceutical company. So this role was created about a year ago when we started our real world data division that was UK focused. So historically there has been a global team, but not one dedicated to UK based studies. And so obviously with real world data and evidence becoming much more important in the decision-making cycle, be it at the regulatory phase or at the market access phase, it was decided that there should be a dedicated team based in the UK. So part of my role is that I kind of in the middle of a lot of people. I work with epidemiologists, which I am by background, but I do very little epi in my day job. And I work specifically focusing on the real world evidence strategy. So particularly much more on the medical side, and also with our health and value team who generally lead things like NICE submissions. So bringing all those parties together, I've been involved in establishing ways of working, setting our vision, identifying what our purpose is. And part of that mainly is to bring to support the development of evidence that's needed to bring drugs to market for breakthroughs that will help patients' lives. So a lot of what I do is making things happen using my technical expertise that I gained from sort of years of working in epidemiology, and also there's a project management element and sort of bringing those two things together. So blending the operations and also the technical expertise that's required for real-world evidence generation.
Thank you. So, do you know, before we go any further, I might just ask you to touch on what real-world evidence data is for anyone that might not understand that.
Yeah, that's a really topical question. I actually ran a focus group on that with patients today. So in a nutshell, typically when we think about evidence and pharmaceutical companies generating evidence, they will typically go through a clinical trials process. And that's a very structured process. There's very strict inclusion criteria. The patient population might not necessarily be reflective of the patients that are going to use those drugs or those products or that intervention in real life. So real world evidence or real world data sort of takes the wheels off of that. And so we look at how things work in the real world outside of a highly controlled clinical setting. So anybody with a condition may be using a particular product, and we will be looking at how that person who may or may not have been able to be included in a trial is reacting, and how that product might be working for that individual person. So it's really just anything that's not in a clinical trial without having to go into details of what a clinical trial is, but how things work in the real world. And we look at things like what's the burden of illness, trends across populations. So are there different groups within a particular disease area that might be more affected than others? Is there age distributed? Is there issues around age? Is there issues around gender? Are there issues around ethnicities? There's so many different factors that can play a role that we don't necessarily have a chance to we might not have that, might not have the ability to cover all of that in a clinical trial. When doing real world evidence, we really see how things work in real life, as evidenced by the name real world.
Yeah, I can imagine. So you mentioned that even in terms of trying to define what this is, real world evidence, you had a patient focus group today. Maybe I can use that opportunity to ask you, in your role, what might a week or 2-week period look like in your diary on a day-to-day basis? If someone was shadowing you for work experience, what would you be doing?
So I think part of what's really a good thing about my role is I get to kind of pick and choose things that I get to work on, which is great for a new role. So over the course of 1 or 2 weeks, it might involve facilitating focus groups with patients to understand what their needs are, and how we can better work with them and partner with them when we are thinking about our evidence generation strategies, because obviously we want it to be applicable to them. So I might spend a couple of days doing some research, looking at what has been done in other settings or other countries, for example, and seeing what could be applicable to the UK market, or where the UK market is different, understanding whether or not there's any compliance issues that we need to be aware of when we're working with patients in the UK specifically. Another day might involve answering questions around operational questions around how to run a real-world data study. So that might involve putting people in contact with other technical experts, such as statisticians, other epidemiologists, other therapy area specialists. So as I did allude to at the beginning, I'm that sort of glue in the middle that makes things happen, not necessarily doing the things, but making them happen. So there might be, I might have a day whereby somebody will come to me with an idea or proposal for a research study, and we'll map out sort of what the steps are that they need to take, the internal and external approval processes that they'll need to go through.
So you had just spoken about talking through people through the various things they might need to do if they would like to run a study.
Right.
So you got to.
So understanding some of the internal processes and procedures that they'll need to follow. So what's very surprising is that some people, I think as scientists, we often know what makes a good research study, but doing it in the pharmaceutical setting, where there's sort of lots of other regulation and rules that we need to be mindful of, the SOPs and sort of the external requirements and the internal requirements that many different companies will have, it can be quite challenging and overwhelming for people. So I tend to walk a lot of my medical affairs colleagues through that process. One thing I probably didn't mention is that we are a growing team, and many of us have come from outside of pharma, myself included. So I have many years of research experience, but not very many years of research experience within the pharmaceutical industry. So I'm learning while I teach as well. So that's often interesting for me. I might, in addition to that, there are different sort of forums that I sit on. And making sure that I'm aware of sort of changes in the field. So one example would be the ABPI code. So constantly keeping abreast with that, understanding any code cases that might come up, and the relevance that it might have for not necessarily something that I'm working on, but something that my colleagues are working on, or things that are associated with the work that we're doing in relation to real world evidence. Other in terms of, I think, I've actually missed a piece. So there's a large part of the role is it deals with sort of internal communications and promoting best practices when it comes to real world data and evidence generation within Pfizer. So one of the things that I've been also involved in is developing essentially a portal that highlights best practices both internally and externally. So I've led that initiative and rolled that out. And then finally, there's been opportunities to collaborate with some of my colleagues to develop training and development workshops when it comes to real world evidence and data, and just understanding sort of the landscape, what's available, what they can do. So yeah, I think that about covers it.
That's a very full-on 2 weeks of work experience, or was it a week that we said? But really exciting.
It might have been a week too. Depends.
It's multifaceted. I love that. So there are a few things you mentioned in terms of understanding how the some of the things you might need to do for the study fits into the UK landscape, for example. You also mentioned, I guess, in terms of maintaining your diary. So in terms of the role setup, is the role based in the UK? Do you kind of do like a UK outlook, or is it a regional role or a global role? What does that look like for you?
So my role specifically is UK focused, but I do have other opportunities to collaborate with colleagues in what we call developed markets. So that's across Europe primarily, and now Canada is joined. And I also do have a lot of communication with our global colleagues, who are generally responsible for sort of setting the overall strategy. And then at the UK level, we implement it locally. But because we are so new and because we are growing, what we've found is that there's a lot of sharing of learning. So things do come from global down, but they also come from, you know, the UK up or other countries up. So there's a lot of you know, collaboration, particularly with other European colleagues. And so there's lots of opportunity for shared learning. So it comes both from global and from the countries as well.
Okay, that's exciting. Then I'm going to pivot into something else you mentioned in terms of the years of experience you have within research versus coming into pharma and trying to do that cross collaboration sharing as you kind of grow within your role, and also the team growing as well. So take us back to basics with what you studied, what you've been doing, and how you landed yourself this job.
So mine has been a very squiggly career. So not the maybe more traditional sort of upward trajectory that, you know, the textbook sort of career. So I initially studied neuroscience, and I had aspirations of becoming a doctor, actually. But I had one course where I was essentially dissecting brains of mice, and I said, nope, that's not for me. So I pivoted, and well, I did complete my degree, and I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. So I think I took a year out and I just worked. And then I think I must have been Googling something randomly, and somehow epidemiology came up. I'd never heard of epidemiology, didn't know what it was. But once I did a little bit more digging and you know, understood what it was doing, that it was looking at you know, sort of health at the population level, I thought, oh, let me just, you know, investigate this and see, you know, what this is all about. And at the time, there weren't very many epidemiologists, or it wasn't something that was, you know, it wasn't a well-known career at the time. But it did coincide with what we had the SARS epidemic in Canada way back in 2003. That's how old I am, dating myself now. And there was definitely a push to get people into public health. It was a really exciting time to be in public health. It wasn't, public health sort of traditionally was kind of, you know, considered, you know, the poor cousin of medicine. But because you know, we had something like SARS, and we're probably also seeing that with COVID as well, there was just some real excitement around being going into public health. So this was in Canada at the time. So I applied and got in, and absolutely thought it was, you know, really, really interesting. It whet my appetite for sort of being involved in the health industry without having to directly interact with people. Not that people are bad or anything, but, you know, that wasn't my cup of tea to sort of be, you know, at the bedside. And you know, there was just so much to learn. It was so interesting. There was so many, you know, therapy areas. You could learn about different methodologies, and just sort of that sort of whole scientific, mathematical working is, I found that really, really interesting. So I did a master's in Toronto, and I worked a couple of years at Toronto Public Health, and then I got a fellowship to go down to the US CDC, which was super exciting. So I did that for a year, and you know, made great connections, and then ended up going back to Canada, and I worked with the Public Health Agency of Canada for another 2 or 3 years. in infectious diseases, and learned so much, made great contacts. Still am in contact with people that I worked with 10 years ago, and I probably would have stayed at the Public Health Agency of Canada because, maybe epidemics follow me. But when I was there, we had the H1N1 pandemic, which was nowhere near the impact of COVID, but at the time it was considered quite significant. So worked on that, got some insight, or lots of insights around sort of how health information, how health statistics are collected. It's a very messy process, very labor intensive. And then randomly, I went to a conference in Jamaica and met what I did not know would be my husband.
Oh, wow.
And how I ended up here. So we met a little over 10 years ago at a conference, and it was during the time whereby it wasn't that easy for people to come abroad and find jobs, not in public health anyway. And so I decided to do a PhD, so I called it a PhD of love. And so I did that at Leeds, and had a great time. I think a PhD was not something that was sort of in my initial sort of plans for my career, but I think it gave me the tools to become an independent researcher, to think, to expand sort of the areas in which I could work. It took me, out of public health, and I was working on studies in the NHS, which is, very, applicable. So I got to see the direct impact of my work and love that experience, love coming over to the UK, learning about another healthcare system. It was, I have nothing but sort of great memories of doing that PhD of love. And I am here. So after my PhD, I did a postdoc for a couple of years at Sheffield. Again, doing something that was very applicable. So at the time I was working on a project that was looking at minimum unit pricing with alcohol. So that was, you work in health and you think it's just healthcare, but it's also very political.
Yeah.
So, we would have our models on, featured on Channel 4, and they would, I think there was one instance where there was something that wasn't quite right, and I was involved in the response to that and the reanalysis of that data. So that also led to some sleepless nights. But it's that blend of sort of medicine and politics and external environments. You quickly realize that healthcare doesn't exist in a vacuum. So I did that for a couple of years, and then took some time out, had a few children, a couple of children, not a few, I don't have that many, and then decided to go into healthcare consulting. And it was within working for consulting that I got exposure to sort of different areas within pharmaceutical companies. So our clients that I would work for typically were on the market access side or the real world data side. And did that for a little while, and then applied for a role at Pfizer. I think that was so obviously the COVID pandemic was wasn't a great time for most of us. No need to rehash sort of what happened with COVID, but one of the things I would say that was an opportunity from it is that it opened up roles that weren't previously available to me. So I've probably not mentioned this, I don't live in London. So anyone who's not familiar with the UK geography, I live in Yorkshire. There are not lots of pharma opportunities in Yorkshire, and sort of maybe pre-COVID, I think remote working wasn't, embraced fully, at least initially for new starters. But what I would say one of the good things that has come out of COVID was that I think people have really started to be a lot more open to where people are located when they're doing their jobs. So applied to Pfizer. I've been in my role for a little over a year now and haven't looked back. So yeah.
Wow. So I think for anyone watching, I'm also hearing this story for the first time in terms of the journey and just how it's really, you said it was a roller coaster and it was an adventure, and it really has been.
I think I call it a squiggly career.
Yeah, it is, and it's the reality though, isn't it? And it's so amazing how what I love about it specifically is the integration of personal life choices, which is the reality, I guess, of what people have to consider and people have to do, and how it's all kind of, you know, come together and led to kind of where you are today. So it's not just something that you just, you know, it's not narrow, it's not straightforward, it's gone round in circles, but ultimately you've come back to something that you do have a passion for. You are having impact, it's related to the pathways that patients have to take, and there's just so much there. So it's so fulfilling. I'm super excited. I'm still in awe. I'm just like, okay. As you kind of went through from one role to the other, I was like, oh, I didn't expect that. And then there was I didn't expect that. So honestly, it's Alexia, it's super cool to kind of have that journey highlighted. Maybe what I'd ask you as well is through your journey so far to your current role and the experience you've had to date, what importance do you think diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of plays when it comes to healthcare as an industry in general? Because you've obviously been involved in it from different perspectives, epidemiology, the research, public health, everything. So what's the importance of D&I in all of this?
I mean, I think it's just the general recognition that, I mean, if I put on my research hat, having a clear understanding or acknowledgement that, you know, what we research might not necessarily reflect everyone's reality, and just being open to that. And when we are open to that, you know, what the next step is to say, okay, how can we communicate better? How can we reach out more to people that this might not be, you know, reflective of? If I'm thinking about it from a research perspective, and it's always just that constant asking. I will always highlight that I'm a very numerical person. I love a good stat, but stats only tell you a piece of the puzzle. We still need to uncover the things that the numbers don't tell us. And I think, you know, just having that, you know, awareness. And I think what I've noticed over the last couple of years is that people, I think these issues have always been there, and people have always, you know, thought about them, but we're becoming a lot more, we're talking about it a lot more, and we're not just talking about it, we're actually taking steps to make sure that, you know, we're, you know, thinking about diversity and equity and inclusion, because it is so important. And, you know, whatever we do, we want it to work for as many people as possible. So I think just having that sort of, you know, constant awareness, constant, you know, questioning. I always think, ask why until you can't ask why anymore, and you know, you probably can never stop asking why, or, you know, how come. So I'll stop there. Unless there's something else that you want to sort of challenge me on. I've talked about it from a research perspective. I don't know if you want to talk about it from a career perspective, or
from a career perspective, how do you think that's played a factor or a role throughout the last couple of years of your career?
In terms of, sorry, so maybe.
So for this particular element, I guess what I'm trying to get at is just for someone else who might be watching, because I guess just thinking about the end viewer, representation is of course important in the various things that you kind of had to go through. So how encouraging has it been? Have you been mentors to other people? Is doing this, for example, this video, is that part of a way of paying it forward in terms of showing different people that might have otherwise maybe not seen representation in certain spaces to say, hey, this is something that you can also get involved in as well? Has it been quite important for you in your own personal career journey to date to kind of see that representation, or have you kind of just pushed yourself personally and just followed your passion, and that's really what's helped you to kind of like break glass ceilings and things? So that's the perspective, and if there's nothing to add on that, that's fine as well.
No, that's a good question. So I think from a personal perspective, I grew up in a place where there wasn't very much diversity, and I just had to, if there was something that I was interested in, I just had to do it, and I might have been the only person. And I think, yeah, so it didn't bother me personally, but I can understand how, not everyone might be as comfortable in those situations. What I would say is that it's important to be comfortable with who you are and just know who you are, and know that you have something to offer, because chances are that you do, even if you are the only one. I mean, there's lots of instances where I definitely always stick out, not even necessarily from being a Black woman in the room. Sometimes I live in the UK and I speak to people with British accents, and I'm like, oh God. I'm always cognizant of, I sound so different. Not even, it doesn't even, I don't even get to the look different. It's I sound so different, and I have to sort of calm those sort of the negative voices in my head that might make me not necessarily want to speak up. But I think from a diversity perspective, I think if we are different, I think having diversity of thought is really important as well. And I think we focus a lot on the differences, but there's also lots that we could focus on in terms of similarities. And oftentimes I've found that I actually do have a lot of things, in common with people that are from totally different backgrounds. So I think sometimes it's just being a bit, if just being open to whatever the opportunity is, and then just having that, possibly confidence, just to say, you're not necessarily if you see people as your equal, you're their equal, and I think that's worked for me. I think everyone has their own journey and experiences, but that's mine.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great advice. I really love what you said there, in the sense of own who you are, know who you are, and you'd be quite surprised in the similarities that you find in others that are not necessarily from the same background. And if you also feel like you do stand out as well, don't listen to negative voices, reassure yourself, be confident, and push for what it is that you have a passion for. So I hear that loud and clear, and I agree.
Cool.
All right, maybe the next question will be around what does the future hold? Based on the journey so far, it's been squiggly. How much more squiggly does it get, maybe in the next year or in the next 5 or 10 years? What does that look like for you?
I won't even attempt to project out to 10 years, because every time I do, I manage to surprise myself. But I suppose in the next sort of year, 3 years, 5 years, I'm really enjoying what I do. So the plan is to continue to grow in this space, to find new opportunities. I think working within real world evidence at the moment, it's so topical. It's at the sort of top of everyone's agenda. So I don't think there's going to be any shortage of things for me to do. It's just something that's really interesting. I think doing research, real world research, it's very exciting, and we'll see. But I plan to continue to work in the space that I'm at, within the pharmaceutical industry. Although there's also been some opportunities to collaborate with academic centers. So I think having that sort of the blend of the two, it suits me quite well. So I think watch this space. I'm sure I'll find a way to make it squiggly, but yeah, I think just continuing to grow in my role and learn more about the industry, is very exciting.
Oh, Alexia, thank you. One final maybe closing point that I can ask is, why did you choose to share your journey with others, and what do you hope that anyone can get out of hearing your path, your story, that maybe you've not already covered?
I think, well, there's a couple of reasons. One being that I think I probably don't have the most traditional of careers. So, if what my path is, if it can, if somebody else can learn something from it, I'm happy to share that story. And I also think it's just a way of giving back, of maybe highlighting the fact that, progression isn't always linear. And you're always having different opportunities to learn, especially when they're in different settings, different countries, as in my case. And none of that's wasted. There's never been sort of, from every experience that I've had, I've always, been able to say, that's why, that happened before. I can apply that here. So I think just having sort of maybe that sort of less traditional story, I think is something that hopefully at least one person might find interesting, and also just to sort of have an opportunity to connect, with yourself, or with anybody else who may watch this video. I think sort of making connections with others outside of sort of work and normal day-to-day interactions is something that and you came highly recommended as well. So all of the above. So yeah, and I think you can get to a point whereby maybe you need to start sharing your story. I'm definitely not the person that would always put myself out there. So just even for my own sort of put myself in a position to do something that I'm not that comfortable doing, talking on on Zoom outside of a work setting. If anyone who knows me knows that I don't do that. But I think the world is changing, so you need to change to stay relevant. So yeah, I think that should all those reasons.
I love it. Alexia, with that, I'd just like to take the opportunity to say thank you for joining us and sharing your story. If you're watching and you like what you heard, like the video, comment on the video and subscribe to find out a lot more and hear about different profiles like Alexia, so you can continue to learn more about the healthcare and the life sciences industry, or perhaps STEM in general.